Okay, so what do you think of the bedroom tax? Are you in support of it, or what's your view on it?
I think it's a particularly iniquitous and unfair measure that's been brought through by the coalition government that's going to have terrible impact on a large number of vulnerable people in Birmingham.
And what's been done to support these vulnerable people? Because out of the 660,000 people, Scope, the UK charity, have actually found that 420,000 people will be affected and they're disabled. How do you think, what's been done for the people that are disabled, the vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, in the Birmingham context, we've also got a real problem here. 10,000 households that are council tenants will be affected by bedroom tax in one way or another, and a further 5,000 who are tenants of the registered social landlords and housing associations in the city will also be impacted by bedroom tax. So this has an enormous impact, and it's not just the impact it has in terms of people's housing. If you think of the knock-on effect of people being uprooted, so the impact on schools places, the impact on health facilities, people's disconnection from their kind of social and family networks as a result of being forced to move properties because of this, it becomes a really big issue. What we've tried to do as a council to address this and some of the broader welfare reform stuff, we've pulled together a multi-agency committee, which I chair as the Cabinet Member for Social Cohesion. That brings together various departments of the council who are directly involved in this, plus partners in the public and the voluntary sector. So we've got the advice agencies, for instance, around the table, housing association partners and so on. What we're doing through that committee is to try and frame a response to welfare reform, put things in place to help people who are going to be directly impacted. So it's partly about doing things like mapping food banks, for instance. It's about laying out where they can access advice, support from on debt and financial advice and things like that. Then, as a local authority, we're doing a number of specific things to help our tenants who are faced by the impacts of the bedroom tax. At the moment, we are contacting all of those we know will be affected, to try and take them through the options of what they can do. I mean, and that starts with, well, if people are able to, they have to make the extra financial contribution themselves, through to how can we try and help people to relocate to properties where they won't be impacted by bedroom tax, i.e. downsizing, and we're in partnership with other local authorities across the West Midlands in order to try and broker some of that. Or look at some of the other options, perhaps about increasing hours at work, or being able to access employment, things like that as well. So we're trying to put all the things we can in place to support tenants. But I come back to that point that this has been foisted onto us by central governments who clearly do not understand the full implications of their own policies.
And you say you're going to help people downsize. How is that actually going to happen? Because I know there is a bit of a housing issue at the moment for, I think it's 2-bedroom properties. There isn't enough. So I know you're working with WMBUS, and they're aiming to pull, I think it's 1,500 houses. How are they going to do that? I mean, how does that work? That's something I'm not quite sure on.
This is not. There's no easy answer to this, because then I come back to that point that we've been forced into. Or people have been forced into this by a government decision, and we're having to try and handle the consequences of that. So it isn't going to be easy to help people to downsize. It's made even more difficult when you look at the changes that take place to local housing allowance, which is the version of housing benefit paid to those in private rented accommodation. That is now, the calculation for that has now been changed and reduced to the 30th percentile, as they call it, which means that local housing allowance will only pay for a limited amount of private rented sector properties in the city compared to what was the case previously. So it has been very, very poorly thought through by government. They haven't seen the longer term consequences of the action they're taking, and they've left local authorities and others with this difficult task of trying to help and support some vulnerable people in dealing with the consequences of this.
So have there been plans in place with WMBUS to pull houses? I mean, where is this?
Yeah, we brokered that arrangement through the Making Best Use of Stock initiative, and it's about trying to pair up people with more suitable accommodation. So, and that's work that's ongoing between those local authorities. There's also the other things that we're trying to do to support tenants. So, for instance, the access to employment, in some cases, potentially taking a lodger or something like that, which isn't an ideal solution by any means. But we're trying to do all the things that we can do with the powers at our disposal to help those people. But I'm not going to stand there and say, yes, that there's a perfect answer to this, because the policy is wrong, it's flawed, and I really do worry about the longer term consequences for people in Birmingham.
Why do you think they've brought this in? Because it does seem a very kind of ill thought out scheme, and they've not really looked into the different societies affected, like the vulnerable, like fostering families and partners that are separated and stuff. Why do you think they've kind of not looked into this and just kind of brought it in?
Well, and I think it's also summed up by the story that broke recently, where there's a case of if you had a situation where one member of the family had gone to prison, you weren't affected by bedroom tax, but if the member of the family was serving in the armed forces, they were. Utterly ridiculous. I think that the reason why this is played out in this way is this is exactly what happens when government makes policy to chase headlines rather than to deal with the actual issue. There was an obsession with pursuing the welfare reform agenda that did win those kind of cheap headlines rather than tackle some of the admittedly thorny issues around welfare reform. The other part of this that I find deeply troubling is that the majority of people who are in receipt of housing benefit, these are working families. Yeah. This whole image of the Chancellor of the Exchequer is coming out with, it's the person who sits behind the closed curtains while you go off to work. This isn't the case. This is about people who are frequently in low-paid, insecure work, trying desperately to make ends meet, and they're now being punished even further. And when you think that 6 out of 10 kids growing up in poverty in this country come from working households, that just shows you how misplaced this policy is. And I really do hope that the government try and think again around this, because the consequences for vulnerable people and families are enormous.
That's the thing we found when we were collecting all our data. We found that it's actually affecting the employed and job seekers more than those that are unemployed. Before we kind of didn't really understand bedroom tax, we were to start our investigation, so we were doing all our research. And when we found out this, we just thought, oh my gosh, this is not right at all. So what kind of things would you say you'd introduce if you had the position right there to renew kind of the whole welfare system? What would you introduce?
I think that welfare has to be based on the principle that work pays. And I think that then leads you into, we have a real issue around low-paid, insecure work. You have a cohort of people who keep throwing themselves into the labour market. They work in low-paid, low-skill, insecure jobs sometime, and then they're always spat out again, so it's back into the benefit system, and then they get back into work. And we're not doing enough to support, to make work pay. So I think one of the best examples of a really progressive welfare policy is what we did when we took control of the City Council back in May and introduced a living wage for council employees. And we're now looking to push the living wage out to our supplier and procurement chains as well, and try and make Birmingham into that living wage city, so people are paid enough to get by on in the first place. That's not been the case. We've had this sort of low-wage, low-skill economy. We can't carry on doing that. So that's where I'd be my starting point for recasting the welfare system. I think this approach has been based on a castigation of the poor, actually setting one set of poor people against another set of poor people in a very divisive way, and it's going to have huge consequences.
Do you know what is happening in certain areas within Birmingham? We were looking at, for example, Ladywood has the highest affected area that is going to be affected in Birmingham. Do you know what's going to happen with any support within the area of Ladywood itself?
What we're doing as the Welfare Reform Multi-Agency Committee at the moment is mapping out the full extent of the impacts, because it's not just bedroom tax, you've got the other welfare changes that are taking place as well. So we're trying to plot out exactly what that looks like across the city. Unsurprisingly, that mapping exercise shows you that it almost completely mirrors the pattern of deprivation and inequality we have in the city. So dark splodges on the map where deprivation is at its worst, again, though mirrored with the impact of the benefit changes. So we're trying to map that out. Alongside that, we're mapping out what kind of support is already available. Come back to, it's criminal that we're having to look at the issue of food banks. Yeah. I absolutely commend those people who are involved in doing that, and they're doing some fantastic work. But I think it's a sad indictment of where we are in 2013 that food banks become part of the system.
One of our team members actually went to a food bank the other week, and she spoke to the lady who arranges them. and she said that there's going to be a massive increase in food banks, and she was saying things like the taxation, the bedroom tax, are going to be part to play in this. So.
In my own ward in Chardon, that I represent, we're looking at 2 food banks now being set up there, led by the local churches, and some of the faith organisations are doing some really good work at the grassroots here to support people. So we are trying to map that out and so people know where these things are and how to access them. We're also doing a lot of work with the advice agencies across the city. We've pulled a partnership with those together to access some money under the Advice Services Transition Fund to try and support frontline advice provision. So that's things like the Citizens Advice Bureau type advice, financial advice, debt advice, help with appeals, because there's a whole set of appeals against benefit decisions that are being taken, and people need supporting through that. So we're trying to put those kind of things in place as well. So yeah, it is a kind of dented shield, if you like, but a dented shield is better than having no shield at all.
And with the bedroom tax as well, the thing is, it seems that they kind of want people to downsize, obviously if they're living in a bigger house, but it almost seems to me that maybe it's kind of adding to this housing situation, because they're trying to get people to downsize. There seems there's not enough houses for them to downsize. But then the West Midlands has one of the highest waiting lists there is. So what do you think about that? Do you think it's adding to a situation, or do you think...
Absolutely. You know, we've got already extensive waiting lists for council accommodation in Birmingham. We've got a shortage of housing, and we need to build more new housing. And as the city expands, and it will over the next 20 years, there's a need to meet that housing demand. There's a whole set of issues around the affordability of housing. If you're looking to buy, you know, there's a whole generation out there who are unable to get onto that property ladder in the same way that their parents and grandparents did. So we've got a set of issues around how we expand the amount of housing and how we ensure it's truly affordable for people living in the city. We've then got other pressures potentially playing in as things like the benefit cap start to hit. Now that has an impact on certain families within Birmingham, but where it really has an impact is in the south east and around London. And you've already got London authorities looking at having to move people out of the capital and coming further north, and of course Birmingham will be affected by that. So you've already got the stock under pressure, it's under further pressure, you've got a private sector that's under pressure because of the restrictions to the local housing allowance. I mean, you couldn't have designed a more perfectly mad system for dealing with this. It really is iniquitous.
And what's been done to tackle this issue? Is there anything in place to build new houses, or? Yeah, I mean, we've through the Municipal Housing Trust, which is sort of extension of our housing department, we're looking to develop and build new affordable homes, and that is programmed in over the next few years. But there's a lot more that needs to be done, and again, it's up to central government here to step up to the plate. We have limited resources as a local authority. Again, when the coalition government came in 2010, one of the first things it did was scrap a whole range of funding around the provision of new affordable housing. So, you know, you're choking off supply there. They have not restored those funds to any meaningful extent. So again, we know what the issue is, we know what the solution is, but we need the resource to be able to do that and do that effectively. What about maybe doing up derelict houses? I spoke to a few people that they felt that was the answer to the whole housing crisis. Instead of building these new houses that you don't have funds to, maybe doing up derelict houses.
And we are doing some of that. We're doing a lease scheme at the moment where we take private houses in that and renovate them, and then we'll let them out to council tenants on a lease arrangement with the owner of that property. But that isn't going to solve the problem. It's a nice additional thing. It certainly eases a little bit of pressure, but when you look at the overall scale of the problem, that is not going to be the solution on itself. It needs to be part of a series of measures, but the provision of more new affordable housing has to sit at the heart of that.
And Yes to Homes we're looking at, they found land the size of Wolverhampton in Birmingham. I'm not quite sure whereabouts it was. And they said they're looking into using that to build new houses. I don't suppose you know what's going on with that, if you know anything on this?
No, I mean, we are looking at how we maximise land use. There are issues around how we align some of this properly, and we don't just work in the silo of, well, this is a piece of city council land, this is a piece of other public sector land. I think we need to look at how we try and align these things far better. That's certainly work and discussions that are going on between the city council and other partners. So yeah, we are trying to do things around that, but there is still that resource issue of, right, how do we ensure that we've got the resource to be able to deliver the amount of housing that we need. We're going to need to build at unprecedented levels, really. So that there's a real challenge there. None of this stuff around bedroom tax and the kind of really short-sighted approach to housing provision is making this any easier.
And what advice would you offer to people who are going to be affected by the bedroom tax in April?
Well, we've actually set up a website to try and help people with that, which is birmingham.gov.uk/important changes, which talks you through a number of the welfare reforms and how they impact on you personally. If you're a city council tenant that's affected by this, you will be contacted by the housing officers who will be there to try and give help and support and advice on the best options for that individual tenant. So we are trying to do that very personalised, bespoke approach that supports the individual. It's not an ideal situation. It's certainly not a situation that this council wants to advocate or support. But these are decisions that the government has taken, and we will certainly do all we can to try and protect people from the worst impacts of those changes.
How do you think this is going to affect Birmingham? Do you think this is going to have massive implications in society?
I think it is, and I think taken in the context of the other benefit change, welfare reforms that are taking place, that's going to have an impact. We've got a city that still has significant issues with inequality and deprivation. And you've got a map of deprivation that hasn't actually changed in the last 20 years. The neighbourhoods where you're less likely to work, where you're more likely to die younger, where your kids are less likely to achieve at school, they're the same neighbourhoods that they were 20 years ago. So we've already got this really ingrained problem with deprivation and inequality, which we're working to address.
Why is that though? Why is it that things haven't seemed to change in the last 20 years?
I think there's a whole complex set of reasons around that. Some of that's around some economic change and the impact of recession, the decline of manufacturing industry. You can talk to a whole range of reasons why. I think some of our interventions to try and tackle that ingrained inequality haven't been as sharply focused as they should have been, frankly. We've tended to do a lot of stuff top-down to communities rather than work bottom-up with those communities to really transform opportunities there. I don't want to discount a lot of the stuff that's happened, because I think it's helped to arrest decline. It certainly stopped situations getting worse in some areas. So, I don't want to throw a whole set of previous initiatives out the window. But we have to accept that the pattern hasn't changed. To some extent, looking at the figures, the inequality's got worse over the last decade in Birmingham. So you've already got a hill to climb. That hill gets steeper when you factor in these public spending cuts that are now taking place, the impact of welfare reform. So you're actually pushing that inequality gap wider rather than working to narrow it. We can do and will do all we can as a city council to try and address that, working with communities, finding different ways to design services, trying to do these kind of support arrangements for those people who are impacted by bedroom tax. But it is going to be a tough challenge.
So it seems that you're not in massive support of the bedroom tax, but do you think in a way it kind of something needs to be done? Because it doesn't seem right that, say there's a family living under the social housing sector and they have got these spare rooms and they are just spare. How do you not just think it's right that they should be taxed for that?
I think you want to make best use of stock, and encouraging people to downsize and helping them to find the most appropriate property for them is absolutely legitimate. I think you also need a welfare system that's based on a clear set of not just rights but responsibilities. I absolutely accept that. But this is such a blunt instrument for doing that. You are just hitting a whole range of people who shouldn't be attacked and hit in this way. And we go back to those ridiculous examples of those who've got children who are serving in the armed forces being faced with having to lose homes. You've got a whole range of other examples of people just being caught by this. And it's just, let's say, such a blunt instrument for trying to force reform through.
What do you think about this, the one that I find just so odd, the fact that foster carers themselves, they have that spare room for when they are caring for a child. So does that mean that they're no longer going to be able to foster?
These are all examples of why this policy is just so deeply flawed. It was designed to chase a headline, in my view, and you know it's generated many of them. I think where government is going to come unstuck is that they'll find that the headlines that this policy starts to generate as it really bites are not the headlines that they would have wanted. We've warned them constantly about the impact that this will have, and they're going to discover that what we're saying to them was accurate and right. But that's great, so we proved right. The bottom line is that vulnerable people in Birmingham are going to get harmed, their families will be harmed, their children will be harmed as a result of the impact of these changes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for your time. I think that's everything
Pleasure.
and more, actually.